In previous videos in this series, I've said that the main job of your EdgeTX controller is to take the position of a physical control, like a stick, a switch, a knob, and to output the position of that physical control through to the receiver, which outputs it to the flight controller or a servo. And there are three main screens in the radio that shape that input before it gets to the receiver. The first one is the input screen. The second one is the mixer screen, and we've talked about those at least a little bit in the previous videos in this series. In this video, we're going to take a look at the third main screen that shapes the output of the controls to the receiver, the outputs screen. And before we get into that content, you should know that this video is part of a series where I go through a whole bunch of information about EdgeTX, the operating system that runs on our radios, to try and teach people more about it. A lot of people know the basics of using it, just enough to get by on a day-to-day basis, but they don't know, like, when you go through all these menus, like, what do they do? And how do you get the radio to do what you really want it to do? That's what this video series is about. And there's a whole playlist. I want to invite you, after you finish this video, to check out that playlist. It's got a whole bunch of information about EdgeTX and will make you a whole lot smarter about how to use your radio. That's linked in the video description below when you get to the end of this one. We're going to start this video on a color screen radio, and to get to the output screen, I'm going to press the menu key, and then outputs is, I can never remember what the icons stand for, so I'm just going to hit the page key, and I'm going to look here until I get, here's inputs, mixes, and outputs. And the main thing that you need to know about the output screen is that it mostly pertains to things you would do if you were using servos. Outputs is about shaping the position of the servo so that the endpoints and the center point are correct. And this is necessary because servos are a mechanical device. So you have a servo and you want the servo to be centered right here, for example, so that your wheels of your car are tracking straight instead of tracking off to the side, or so that your control surface on your airplane is flat and level instead of deflected up or down. But the center point of that servo may not be exactly right, and the output screen is going to let us adjust the center point of that servo. Likewise, the servo is going to deflect up and down, and there may be mechanical limits on how far you want the servo to go. For example, your control surface may only be able to go so far without, like, binding up against something. Let's imagine that the servo's job was to close a door or to retract a landing gear on an airplane. Well, at a certain point, the door is closed, or the door is open, or the landing gear is fully retracted, or the landing gear is fully open. And you don't want the servo to keep pulling or keep pushing and trying to go past that point. So when we're working with servos, we need to adjust the center and the endpoints of the servo's travel. And we could do that with the inputs and the mixer screen, but it would be very cumbersome, and it makes sense to take that specific function and remove it to a separate screen, the output screen, so that we can set the endpoints in the center of the servo in the output screen and then forget about that. And in the inputs and the mixer screen, we can just pretend that 0 to 100%, the full travel of the servo, is whatever it needs to be, and trust that the output screen is taking care of limiting the endpoints in the center of the servo's travel. So if you're not working with servos, do you just need to skip this video? No, you still need to know a few of the things that are in here, and we wouldn't want to leave like just a blank hole in your knowledge. Let's take a look at the output screen. We can see on the output screen that we have every channel that the receiver can output, or that the controller can output. And well, the radio supports up to, I think, 32 channels, but of course, most radio links that we'll be using will support between 8 and 16 channels. Those extra channels just aren't going to do anything if your control link doesn't support them. If we go down to channel 1 and we click and edit, we can see here are the parameters to edit. And the first thing we can edit is the min and max value of the channel. In fact, let's see, which channel is my throttle? My throttle is, well, here you can see as I move the throttle, you can see here the output of the channel and the channel position. I can actually see that moving, and that's very handy because it means I can easily see that my throttle is channel 3. So let's go down and let's adjust channel 3. You can see that if I adjust the min value, if we then look in Betaflight, you can see here my throttle channel's min value is 989. And if I click and adjust, I can roll that, and you can see that as I adjust the min value, the minimum, the lower value of the channel continues to rise. So I'm setting the low endpoint. If I raise the throttle all the way up, you can see I can do the same thing with max. I can roll that down, and I can bring that in. And I've completely jacked up my throttle. Don't do this. This is just a demonstration. But you can see that now I've changed my throttle, so it now goes 1280 to 1797. And in real life, what we would do with a servo is we would deflect the stick or deflect the control, and we would adjust the min so that the servos travel was right where we wanted it to be, so that the door was completely closed, or maybe just slightly more than closed. So we had a little pressure holding that door closed. But we would adjust those endpoints so that the servo was exactly where we wanted it to be. We just do that via trial and error. We just roll that until it gets where we need it to be. So what do we do with these things if we're not using servos, if we're using Betaflight? The main thing that we do is we adjust the endpoints. Betaflight wants the endpoints of our channels to be 1000 to 2000. So if I put these limits back to -100 and +100, you can see that the actual channel values Betaflight sees is 989 to 2012. But Betaflight wants it to be 1000 steps, and so Betaflight wants the channel to go from 1000 to 2000. And we can fix that with the endpoints. So with the throttle all the way down, I can edit the min value, and I can just start rolling the jog wheel to raise that up until the throttle channel gets to a value of 1000. And I've set my lower endpoint correctly. And I can push the throttle all the way up, and I can edit the max value, and I can roll that down until that gets to a value of 2000. And now I have set the endpoints just as Betaflight wants it to be. That channel is going 1000 to 2000. And that change is going to be true for all flight controllers that I use with this model on the radio. We fix the endpoints in the radio. You can also fix the endpoints in the flight controller. There's another way to do that. That's not relevant to this tutorial because that's a Betaflight function. But if you fix the endpoints in the flight controller, then you've only fixed one quadcopter. But if you fix the endpoints in the EdgeTX controller, you fixed it for everything that is used with that model, and that's nice. Now we've adjusted the endpoints of the channel, but you can see that those adjustments are limited to plus and minus 100%. What if we need to go further? There are servos that can go even further than 100%, extended travel servos. And there are also sometimes when working with a flight controller, where we would want to extend those signals out. In order to do that, we can enable the extended limits, and that will let us go up to, I think, 150% with the endpoints. Now, you'll notice that we have made that change on the throttle channel, but you see the yaw channel still is not correct, the roll channel is still not correct, and so on. And you can see the numbers we ended up with are pretty consistent. We've got like 97.8, is that right? Yeah, we've got 97.8 for both of the values. We could just manually copy those numbers in, but in fact we don't have to. If I go back out to the main page and I click the jog wheel, do you see copy? There's an option there that I'm not seeing, so let's go over to my black and white screen radio, and let me just show you the exact same thing there, and we'll see if the option that I'm looking for is there, and then we'll try and figure out where it is on the color screen radio. And the option I'm looking for is this option, copy min-max to all. That's going to copy the endpoint values to all of the channels and basically fix all of them all at once. Because unlike a servo, where the correct min and max value would depend on the physical construction of the servo, and you'd need to manually set the min and max for all your servos, in this case, it's just a software thing, and it's going to be the same for all the channels. So like all the channels need the exact same min and max values. And you can see, in fact, that I've done that. All of my channels are set to the exact same min and max values. It seems like that option is just not there. I can't find it in the manual or anything. That's weird, and maybe one of you guys will tell me in the comments what I'm missing. It seems like the option's not there. Well, score 1 point for the black and white screen radios. I guess the color screen guys have to do it manually. So be it. Next, let's take a look at the subtrim option. And in order to explain subtrims, we'll just briefly talk about trims. So trims are these switches that are in various places on different radios. On the Boxer, the trims are here and here. And if we look in the Betaflight receiver tab, we can look at the pitch axis. And do you see that the pitch axis is not quite centered? It's at 1503 when it should be centering at 1500. Now, the right way to fix that is to recalibrate the gimbals, but in real life, we might not have time to do that. Instead, what I can do is I can just use this trim switch and I can trim. By pressing down, I can trim that axis back into center. But trims are not just used to make a channel be numerically centered. Trims are used more with servos to adjust the tracking, for example, of a steering rack. What is the correct center position for your steering? Well, it's not an arbitrary servo position. It's whatever servo position causes the car to track straight forward. What is the correct center position for an elevator control surface on an airplane? It's whatever position causes the airplane to neither climb nor descend. So what you'll do is while you're flying or driving or whatever, you'll reach down with your finger and you'll adjust the trim so that you're adjusting the center point of the channel. And you can do that for any of your channels. Left, right, up, down. See here we're adjusting the roll trim. And what you'll do is you'll sort of blip those so that your vehicle is tracking straight and true when your sticks are centered, and those are your trim positions. But there's a difference between a temporary adjustment in the channel center, which is trim, and a permanent adjustment that you want to persist across multiple sessions. So if you were to take and put a heavy weight on your aircraft, causing it to be a little bit nose heavy, you might need a little bit of up trim on the elevator to cause it to track straight and true, but that's not a permanent change. That's not how you normally fly the aircraft. On the other hand, if you had just built the aircraft and because of the way you've set up the servo control horn and the servo control arm or push rod and so forth, because of the way you set it up, the elevator just needs a little bit of trim all the time to fly centered. That's where we would get to what we call subtrim. Subtrim is this parameter here in the output screen. And subtrim and trim do the same thing. They adjust the center point of the channel. But the difference is that subtrim is sort of the permanent default 0 position for the channel. And trim is just right this minute, I real quick need to blip it and change it, but I'm going to return to the default position later. Now, one way to adjust the subtrims is to just go in here, click and edit, and change the subtrims. But that's like, you don't always know what the correct subtrim value is going to be. Instead, what people will often do is they will fly the aircraft or drive the vehicle, and they will use the trim switches to adjust the trims on the vehicle. And then when they're done flying, the trims will be in the correct position. And what they'll do then is, if we back out to the main screen, we can choose Add All Trims to Subtrims, which is this button up here. And if I hit that button, look at this column here. This is the subtrims column. And what that's going to do is that's going to permanently add all of the trim values to the subtrim for those channels and then reset the trims. So the trims are now at 0. The subtrims are what the trims were, and basically the trimmed out values have become the new default for the channel center. And of course, I don't like that because I'm just going to tap here and I'm going to choose default to 0 that out. Default, zero that out. Because that's making my channels be all messed up, and I don't actually want that. So to recap that, trims are a temporary on-the-fly adjustment to the channel's center that are done by pressing the trim switches on the radio. Subtrims are a more permanent change that is done in the output screen that is designed to reflect the default center position of the channel. Now, as long as we're talking about the add trims to subtrims function, let's talk about some other functions that are involved in moving trims over to subtrims. And if I just highlight a channel and click, we can also see copy axis to subtrim. And what that's going to do is that's going to take my stick position at any given time and copy that value to the subtrim. So for example, I could move the roll stick and I could have the aircraft on the bench and look at the position of the control surface as I move the roll stick, and I could hold the roll stick in a certain position, and when the control surface was where I wanted it, I could copy axis to subtrim, and however deflected the roll stick was, that value would be copied to the subtrim. That doesn't seem super useful to me because most of the time why wouldn't I just manually adjust the subtrim until the control surface was where I wanted it to be? But if for some reason it's more convenient to do that by moving the stick, you can do it that way. And then we've also got the copy trims to subtrim, which is going to sound an awful lot like add trims to subtrim. So what's the difference between them? The add trims button, which you see right here, takes the trim values, moves them to the subtrim values, and resets the trims. The copy trim to subtrims takes the trim values, moves them to the subtrims, and leaves the trims where they are without resetting them. And that doesn't make a lot of sense to me because, like, what am I missing? If I trim the elevator up to 1533 and then do copy trims to subtrim, yeah, now we've got that applied twice. We're adding a small, we're offsetting the center in the subtrim, and because we didn't reset the trim, we're also offsetting the center with the trim. I kind of don't see the point of that. You can see that when we did that, it went from 1533 to 1563. Maybe if I flew fixed wings more, that would make sense to me. Now, what I just described to you is how subtrim works when we have the subtrim mode set to center only. In that mode, when we change the subtrim, the center of the channel moves up and down, but the endpoints stay the same. Notice that if I have the throttle all the way down, if I come up and I change the subtrim, the top and bottom are not changing. So what we're doing is we're sliding the center of the channel around, and we are stretching and compressing the parts of the channel to the left and the right of the center without changing the endpoint. And that means that when we do that, we will get uneven throw on either side of the center. This doesn't matter very much when you're making very small adjustments, like if your channel is centering at 1503 and you use subtrim to adjust it to like 1500, you're not going to really notice that. But if you have big changes in the subtrim, then if you have an actual control surface, it can actually make a difference, like in how fast your plane can turn left versus how fast your plane can turn right, because the servo isn't centered up. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my subtrim and I'm going to set it. Let's set the throttle in the center, and I'm going to take my subtrim, and you can see I'm setting it to just a wildly different value. I'm setting it to 17, 18, 19, 20 points. And we can see that now the throttle channel is centering at 1630, far away from 1500, which is the default center. But notice that the top of the channel is still 1999 and the bottom of the channel is still 1000. So 1000 to 2000, or nears makes no difference. If I then go and change the subtrim mode from center only to symmetrical, look at the difference. Now, if we put the throttle all the way down, notice that the bottom of the channel is 1155. Now, changing the channel center is also changing the bottom. So what we're kind of doing is we're kind of sliding that bottom half of the channel up without changing its size. And likewise, if I move the subtrim to the left, we can see that the top of the channel comes down. So again, I'm sliding the top of the channel down. And in fact, what I'm actually doing is I am sliding the entire channel width up and down, but you're not seeing that result because we've got the min and the max set at 1000 to 2000. What's happening there is a thing called clipping. So if I've got a channel and it's this wide and I move the whole channel down, it's going off the bottom of the scale. It's going outside that 1000 to 2000 range that I set when I set my min and my max. And so it's essentially just cutting off that travel because the servo is not allowed to travel outside of that range. If I were to change the weight of this so that we bring the channel endpoints in, we could see this effect more clearly. Let me just do that real quick. So we're going to go to the mixer, and we're going to take the throttle channel, or the throttle mixer, and we're going to change that weight from 100%, and we're going to change it to 75%. The throttle is only 75%, and now if we go to the outputs, and we edit that channel, let's just set that subtrim back to 0 so we can see the effect. Okay, so now we can see that the throttle is going from 1125 to 1874. Here are our min and max endpoints, and our throttle channel is now inside those endpoints. And what we'll now see is that with subtrim mode set to symmetrical, as I move the subtrim up and down, that entire channel range is going to move up and down. So if I subtrim to the right, we can see that the bottom of the throttle is going up and the top of the throttle has gone up by an equivalent amount. And if I subtrim down to the left, we can see that the top of the channel has come down, and we can see that the bottom of the channel has come down. But if I continue to subtrim to the left, notice that that throttle channel is going to get to 1000, and it's not going to get any lower because that's our hard limit. And if I keep going just wildly down, you can see that the center throttle is now at 1251. Let's keep going. the center throttle is now 1103. So you can see I only have like 100 points of throttle movement when I lower the throttle, but I have full travel when I raise the throttle. So you can get yourself into some pretty screwy situations there. I think there's two takeaways from this, and the first is that you should always try to mechanically center your servos as best you can. You should adjust your control herns, you should adjust your push rods and so forth, so that when the servo is in its center position, the control surface is as close to the center position as it can be. And that will give you the maximum amount of throw to either side and the maximum amount of flexibility to then adjust the endpoints, the weight, and so forth using software. The other thing to take away from this is that the subtrim mode of center only is what most people are going to be using, and I think that the center mode of symmetrical is a little hard to imagine times when you might do it. But you could imagine a case where the servo is mounted slightly cockeyed. And what you want to do is not just adjust the center, but adjust the entire rotation of the servo so that the center and both endpoints sort of clock around by a few degrees in order to get things how they need to be. That's a case when you might use the symmetrical movement. Finally, we come to the PPM Center option. And PPM Center is similar to Subtrim in that it adjusts the center of the channel, but there's one key difference between them. One thing I want you to keep in mind is that if you're not working with servos or other physical control surfaces, if you're just feeding a receiver signal into a flight controller, forget PPM Center exists. You should only use Subtrim. PPM Center is only for when you're working with servos or other physical controls. In order to demonstrate PPM Center, I'm going to go back to the mixer screen. We're going to go back to the throttle channel, and we're going to set the weight back to 100%. No, not 0%. And then we're going to go to the output screen. And I showed you previously that if I put the throttle all the way up and then I change the subtrim mode to symmetrical and I adjust the subtrim, as I raise the subtrim, nothing will happen because we can't go above the endpoint, the max endpoint of 2000. But if I change the PPM Center, I want you to see that the PPM Center will allow me to exceed that endpoint. So in theory, PPM Center is useful because it's the only thing that lets you push outside the min and max endpoints. Although I'm a little bit confused about this though, because like the idea that sometimes you would want to be able to adjust that output to ignore the min and max that you had previously set sort of makes sense, but it only let me go up to 2012. So the default channel width is 998 to 2012. And then as I showed you previously, if you enable extended limits, it allows you to go outside that range. However, in this case, it didn't. And that's a little weird to me. What if I set the max to like some really high value? If I set the max just way outside the pale, and then I'm going to adjust the PPM Center, will that let me go further? No. PPM Center still won't go above 2011. I don't understand. So with Subtrim, I can... Oh, I guess... Okay, I'm coming up with a scenario. Let's imagine a scenario where we've got the max value set way far in, right? Like we got a servo with minimal travel, and then we go to PPM Center and we adjust it, and that lets us push outside that range. Aha. So 2012 is still the hard cap on the max value you can send, even with PPM Center, and likewise 998 is still the min cap. But the idea is that PPM Center lets you adjust the width of the channel bypassing the min and max endpoints, and PPM Center is always symmetrical. It's just sliding the whole channel up and down. Okay, sure, I'm glad I don't do a lot of fixed wing stuff in servos. This all sounds like a pain in the ass. Finishing out the options on this screen, we've got the inverted option, which just inverts the channel. So right now, if I pull the pitch axis all the way down, we get 1,000, and if I push it up, we get 2,000. But if I invert, then we'll get the opposite. Down will be 2,000 and up will be 1,000. This is especially, well, if you're using servos, then you may need to map the servo's direction of travel to the stick direction, and you may want to flip it if the control is backwards for some reason. But this is also useful when you're working with some bind and flies or other vehicles where you don't have the option to like just flip which way the servo goes or something. Like if you've got a bind and fly car and it just expects the throttle to go one way or expects the steering to go one way, then you may need to use the inverted option to flip it. I want to point out that there's other ways we could have done this. We could have gone into the mixer screen and set a weight of -100. That would also invert the channel. We could have gone to the input screen and set a weight of -100, and that would also invert the channel. There's no one right way to do these things. Personally, I usually tend to invert channels using the mixer screen, except when I'm working with servos and the mechanical configuration of the servos means that one of the channels needs to be inverted to keep the servos moving the same direction. When it's something software related, like I just want to change which direction a switch moves the channel, I'll do that in the mixer screen with a weight of -100. My thinking is that I'm more likely to just forget that the output screen is inverting the channel and then get confused later just because it's not an option that I typically touch. Now we've done almost this whole video on the color touchscreen radio, so let's just take a brief look at the black and white radio. But there's not that many differences, frankly, in this particular screen. So you can see here in the output screen on the radio, we've got the exact same settings: subtrim, min, max, direction. That's the inverted option. We have the direction is either inverted or default. So it's a little bit different in the wording that they use, but it's the same function. We've got the curve and we've got the PPM Center. And finally the subtrim mode, which is either symmetrical or center only. I wonder if it works on this radio. I hope you're learning a lot in this video series. If you are, would you please consider joining my Patreon? Patreon is a website where you subscribe to me. The minimum entry fee is $2 a month, and you get some rewards like getting access to my Discord server, but mostly what you get is a good feeling that you're giving something back. I make this content for free. I put it out there for free. I don't charge you anything. Don't put it behind a paywall. And I just hope that eventually you'll come to a point where you'll go, okay, I feel like giving something back. If today's that day, there's a link in the video description below to my Patreon. I'd love to have you as a supporter at whatever level you think is fair for the amount of value you get out of my content. If that's $2 a month, great. If it's $10 a month, even better. You subscribe at whatever level you feel like, and you can raise or lower or cancel whenever you feel like that's the right thing for you to do. Links in the video description below. Thank you so much. The output screen is incredibly important for anybody who uses servos or any other physical motor or control that's going to operate in the real world. And the reason for that is, like in software, if we send a channel outside of its assigned range, nothing bad really happens, just some software isn't very happy. But if we have a servo or an actuator arm that we try to move outside its assigned range, we can break things. We can burn out motors, we can smash physical objects, potentially in extreme situations, we could even injure people. So you're really going to want to pay attention because the output screen's main job is restricting the physical movement of servos and other such controls and setting their default positions. To recap this video then, if you don't work with servos or other physical controls, the main thing you're going to do in the output screen is adjust the min and the max so that your flight controller sees the endpoints that it wants to see. And the default for that is usually 1000 to 2000 as the PPM values. You're also going to use subtrim to set the center where the flight controller expects it to be, which is usually a value of 1500. And we said earlier that if your sticks aren't centering correctly, you should really recalibrate your gimbals. But especially on old or cheap radios, you may not be able to get the channels to center exactly right, and subtrim is the fix for that. Once you set the min, the max, and the subtrim so that your channels have the right endpoints and center, that's probably going to be it. You're probably never going to look at the output screen again. On the other hand, if you do work with servos and other physical controls, you're going to manually set the endpoints and the centers so that the safe limits of travel are respected. And it's really important to understand that this output screen comes last in the output because it is the ultimate safeguard against pushing a servo or other physical control out of its safe operational limits. We can do whatever we want in the mixer. We can put a weight of whatever we want. We could put a weight of 200 in the mixer, which would push the channel way out of its safe range. But the output screen is the guardrails. The channel will never exceed the values assigned in the output screen under, I won't say under any conditions, but under almost any conditions. And that is incredibly important when working with these physical controls. It's also worth pointing out that if you've got a situation where you're trying to drive a channel to a certain value and it won't go past that value, it may be the output screen putting those guardrails on that's preventing it from going to the value that you want. There are many more videos in this EdgeTX playlist, and if for some reason you haven't watched all the other ones, here is a card to the whole playlist, And you can learn everything you want to know about EdgeTX. If you don't see the card for some reason, there's also a link to the whole playlist in the video description below, and I'll see you there.